Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Sandy Treadway, a member of the St. John's Church Foundation Board of Trustees and chair of the Programs and Education Committee. On behalf of all the board and the staff at St. John's, I am delighted to welcome you this evening to the Walter W. Craigie Speaker Series. We are excited this evening to welcome Dr. Douglas Egerton as our 9th Walter W. Craigie Speaker. Dr. Egerton is a professor of history at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, where he teaches early American and 19th century US history. Professor Egerton's work focuses on the intersections between race and politics. The author or co-author of more than 10 books, 2 of his works, Gabriels Rebellion and Rebels, Reformers, and Revolutionaries, explore how race in the context of slave rebelliousness affected society and politics in the early South. Please join me in welcoming the 9th Walter W. Craigie Speaker Series Spring Speaker, Dr. Douglas Egerton.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I appreciate being invited to speak. I'm also very happy to go back and revisit a book I wrote 30 years ago when I had brown hair. This came out in 1993. And so I think I pretty much finished writing by 1991. It went to press, UNC published it. So it's a lot of fun to go back and kind of revisit something I wrote a very long time ago. Let me start with an odd observation. Late in life, Jefferson and John Adams achieved a détente of sorts. After not speaking for more than a decade, in New Year's Day of 1812, Adams sent Jefferson a letter, and they began to correspond for the next 14 years, and they discussed everything under the planet. And one of the most interesting exchanges they had was the meaning of the American Revolution. And in one letter, Adams said, the revolution was never about battles. It was never about treaties. He said it was a revolution in the hearts and minds of America. It began long before 1776. It began at least at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. If Adams is right, the next question is, when did the American Revolution end? If it was not about battles, it did not end in 1781 at Yorktown. If it was not about treaties, it did not end in 1783 in Paris. Adams, I think, was right. The revolution was an idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And on the day Jefferson penned those famous words, 37% of Virginians were enslaved, Africans and African Americans. The national average was 1 in 5 Americans were enslaved, or 20% of the population. And one of those born that same year, 1776, Jefferson wrote those words, was a boy on a plantation right outside of Richmond called Brookfield Plantation, and the boy's name was Gabriel. For many Americans, I think both white and black, the revolution did not end in 1783 because its promise was unfulfilled. In Massachusetts, Captain Daniel Shays led veterans to close down courts because their farms were being repossessed. In the 1790s, the Whiskey Rebels rebelled against what they thought was an unfair tax. It was a violation of American principles. But maybe the revolution ended in the fall of 1800. When old white revolutionaries hanged young black men who compared themselves to General Washington. So here's where the plantation was. This is the Chamberlain Farms right outside of Richmond. And this kind of area on the right that has this sort of long oval and kind of parallel roads right next to the freeway. That's where Brookfield was. And of course, the plantation is long since gone, but the street there is now called Brookfield. There's about 2,000 acres, wheat and tobacco plantation. The owner had the house and the main outbuildings, not the blacksmith shop, unfortunately, insured. And so here's the map they drew, so we know the dimensions of the house, how big it was. And so so this was the insurance policy, basically. It was owned initially by Thomas Prosser, who was a sometimes member of the House of Burgesses, a very litigious man who was almost always in court getting sued and being sued. And his longtime attorney was Patrick Henry, who was a family friend. At the war's end in 1783, Virginia did a massive census to see who lived in the state. There had been, of course, a lot of dislocation during the Revolution. It's the one time in Virginia history where the census named slaves by name, and not just by number or by age. So there on Brookfield are 53 slaves, and there is 7-year-old Gabriel. Unhappily, they're grouped by age and not by family cluster, so it's impossible to tell from looking at that census who Gabriel's parents are. And there's his younger brother Solomon pretty close by him, so apparently it is by age. But 53 slaves is a very large Virginia state. Only 3 homeowners, planters in Henrico County owned more slaves than Thomas Prosser did. Again, we don't know much about his family. The best guess is that Gabriel's father was a blacksmith. I'm sure all of you have been to plantation museums. And they're basically kind of sort of medieval villages. Every great planter has to have 2 carpenters and a blacksmith and this and that, and a bootmaker. And of course, slaves are not allowed to acquire property beyond the odd table or chair. But the one thing they can bequeath to their children is kind of a better life if they are. If you are a domestic slave, your daughters become a domestic slave. So most likely Gabriel's father was also a blacksmith, because then his brother Solomon, who's pretty close to his age, becomes a blacksmith also. And of course, also born in 1776, it was Thomas Henry Prosser, which is Prosser's son. And of course, he's named after family friend and attorney, Patrick Henry. So it's quite possible that as a boy, Gabriel actually laid eyes on Patrick Henry if he came to visit at Brookfield. So because he's actually born on the estate and is the same age as the man who comes to own him in 1800, Gabriel probably is one of the few slaves who actually knows his exact birth year, quite possibly his birth month, and even possibly birth date. He grew to be a huge man. He was 6'2" or 6'3", at an age when most men, white or black, are 5'6", 5'7", 5'8". There's a description of him because, of course, he's on the run briefly when the conspiracy collapses. And so his owner says he has a long, bony face, well made. He's missing his 2 front teeth, and he has scars on either side of his face. Probably, I would guess, from mixing it up in the plantation with the other, young men. There is no reliable image. If you go on, Google Images, there's all these pictures, but of course, there is no reliable image of Gabriel. Probably he dressed like a blacksmith, meaning a leather apron. And of course, he had to be physically very, very strong. He'd been working in the forge probably for about 10 years by the time the conspiracy takes place. And he grew up in a state and in a country that was changing very, very rapidly. So quick backstory, going back to 1705, under Virginia law, one could not free their slaves in their will, just outright, without the express written permission of the colonial governor. So after the Revolution, actually toward the end of the Revolution, 1782, Virginia passed the law, Reform Act, saying masters, if they wished, could free their slaves, provided they were not in debt. Of course, a lot of these guys were always in debt. So, Washington famously freed his slaves in his will. And overnight, a lot of whites began to free, usually favored slaves. Older women, white women would free a domestic slave who'd been kind of a long life of service. Probably the best guess is right after 1782, when this law is passed, maybe in the entire state, there's 2,000 free blacks. By 1790 in the census, there's 12,766. And by 1800, there's 20,124. So that's a 28,000 increase in 18 years. What this means is that suddenly, if you are a slave in Henrico County, probably like Gabriel's parents, suddenly people who are free. You've got cousins and friends and spouses and uncles who are free, and you're not. And so that's clearly a motivation to think, well, my life could be better too, just like theirs. So the percentage of free blacks by 1790 is only 4.2, out of the blacks in the state. But again, that's a 28,000, human bump in 18 years. So the next big chance for Virginia to pass a Reform Act came in 1796. In that year, this man, St. George Tucker, penned this pamphlet over here, a dissertation on slavery and a proposal for the gradual emancipation of it in the state of Virginia. St. George Tucker was not just some guy. He was one of the best legal minds in the state. He taught law at the College of William and Mary. He was the judge in the state's general court. He'd married into one of the most powerful families in the state, but I think also explaining his behavior, he was not a Virginian. He was born in Bermuda, and of course, slavery was legal in Bermuda when he was young, but it wasn't the kind of slave society that Virginia was, where again, more than a third of the population were enslaved people. It's important also to remember how small the patriot founding elite really were. I mean, the historian Joseph Ellis calls them founding brothers. 55 guys who meet in Philadelphia and write the Constitution. They knew each other from the Articles of Congress, from the Continental Congress. They'd frozen together at Valley Forge. So when Tucker decided to get into his head to try to pass some kind of law or create a proposal for gradual emancipation, these guys knew who to contact. So he wrote to reformer friends in the North, in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and said basically, send me your ideas. How did you guys do it? How did you get rid of slavery in Pennsylvania? That kind of thing. And they sent back copies of legislation and all kinds of ideas and suggestions. And of course, the most famous was 1780. The first state to pass a law for gradual emancipation was Pennsylvania, a state that had a very, very small number of blacks. It was 4% black. But they passed a law that is for gradual emancipation. And so you probably all know this, but the way it works is for slaves born after July 4, 1780, when they get to the age of 28, they're free. They walk out of their master's house, the shirt on their back, no back payment, they become free. And of course, the virtue of doing this is that nobody was freed, the day the law went into effect. So there was no cost for the state of Pennsylvania. They're freeing people who are not yet born. So they're not freeing somebody who is currently, capital. They're freeing someone who's going to be capital down the road. So it's very gradual. So understanding that Virginia was not Pennsylvania, Tucker wrote a very different kind of proposal, but it's based on the Pennsylvania law. So under his plan, anybody born after the law is passed. So again, it's 1796 is the plan. Let's say 1798. Women, only women born after the law is passed at the age of 21 become free. Then when that woman becomes free and has children, then her children, regardless of gender, then they're born free too. So it's really going to kind of drag things out. But Tucker understands that Virginia 37% black is not Pennsylvania 4% black. So it's a very, really gradual emancipation. And what made it unique is that other Virginians, most notably Thomas Jefferson, had concocted kind of vague plans for gradual emancipation, but Jefferson always combined it, with forced colonization. You become free, you got to leave Virginia. And even then, critics said to him, no Virginia planter is ever going to free their slaves if the working class in Virginia is then sent someplace else. And so one of the virtues of Tucker's plan, and by the way, it's still in print in hardback, or at least it was when I was in graduate school, is that it did not have colonization. So the plan is people become free, but they stay in Virginia. And Tucker went into great, almost kind of excruciating detail of what people get when they become free, what kind of blanket they get. But he made it very, very clear. They become free, but that's it. No voting rights, no carrying a gun. They become a free but politically powerless agricultural proletariat. But as he put it in his pamphlet, the earth will not want cultivators with this plan. In other words, there still will be people working the fields. So it's a really gradual plan, and he sent it to his friends, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and said, how about an endorsement? You've been talking about this. How about now, an endorsement for this kind of plan? And of course, Jefferson had just been elected vice president, so he had real national clout. And instead of endorsing it, they both chose to quibble about the plan. And Jefferson wrote back and he said, well, the flaws in the plan, because again, it's only a woman who becomes free after being born after the law at the age of 21. He says wives will be free and husbands will not. Sons will be free and fathers will not. As if every parent doesn't want their child to have a better life than they have had. And he said, there must be a compromise between the passions, the prejudices, and the real difficulties of emancipation, unquote, as if the Tucker Plan didn't do all those things and more. It's kind of a perfect compromise. So he lays it on the House of Virginia Assembly, and Jefferson and Madison declined to endorse it. And it's tabled without discussion. They're just literally they're not going to debate the plan, and it goes no place. So, I tell my students that we all say actions have consequences. Failure has consequences as well. I mean, here's a real chance for the state that had numerically the most slaves in the entire country. Lower percentage in South Carolina, but numerically more than any other place. To pass a law to get rid of it. Jefferson famously said, "We have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold it safely nor let it go." And he was wrong. This was a chance to let it go, and he didn't. Think about it this way. We know almost nothing about Gabriel's wife. She appears only once in trial documentation. She's referred to as Nanny. We don't know if Nanny is an occupational nickname, if she is in charge of children on the estate, or if it's the kind of familiar version of Nancy. But say, for example, it's quite possible that she's actually not even yet 21, because Gabriel's 24 when he's hanged, so he might be slightly older. So it's possible, actually, if the law had passed 1796, Nanny becomes free. But the worst case scenario is that she's too old, and so therefore she does not become free upon reaching the age of 21. But then she has a daughter in 1798. And the daughter is born free, or the son is born free. So by the time Gabriel would have been in his mid-40s, he would have free children. By the time he was my age, he would have free grandchildren. He would remain a slave. But his family would be free. And what father and grandfather, would not want that? And think about how everything would have been changed had the Tucker Plan passed. There'd be almost no slavery in Virginia by 1831, and so no Nat Turner uprising, no 55 dead white people in Southampton County. There would be no secession, no Civil War. We'll never know what would have happened had the law been passed, but we know what does happen because the law was not even considered. A massive internal slave trade in which more than 1 million Black Americans are sold and resold and sold again between the American Revolution and the outbreak of the Civil War. At least 700,000 young men die at places like Gettysburg and Antietam because this generation had a chance to get it right, and they didn't. So slaves knew what was happening, or they knew what was not happening. And again, Gabriel is literate. He lives quite near Richmond. White people talk, and slaves hear white people talking. But again, Gabriel has access to information. He's often in Richmond, so he hears people talking. Again, he's a blacksmith. He often hires this time, so he's often in the city. And his owner in 1800, Thomas Henry Prosser, the son, was courting and finally married a woman named Lucy Hilton, spelled with a Y. And Daniel Hilton had just moved from New York City down to Virginia and brought slaves with him. And in 1799, New York passed the gradual emancipation law. So the slaves immediately run for it. They try to get back to New York, probably either because it's freedom or because they have family there. So quite possibly Gabriel knew what had happened, 1799, in New York, maybe what had happened earlier in neighboring Pennsylvania. Even if he heard these rumors imperfectly, quite possibly thought, a shove will kind of get things going and kind of force the state into some kind of plan for manumission without removal. But suddenly Gabriel understood if he was going to become free, that meant picking up the sword. And of course, as luck would have it, he and Solomon are blacksmiths. And one of the many things they do is sharpen scythes used on the wheat farms. And so they start just kind of snapping the scythes in half and sharpening them into these pretty serviceable, very heavy swords. The other turning point in his story and in Virginia's story came in September of 1799. The usual slave diet is low on protein, it's high on starch. And so every enslaved father had the responsibility to trap game, hunt game, put some meat on the table. And quite near his plantation, the master's plantation, Gabriel and Solomon and one of their friends named Jupiter, who's also another of Prosper's slaves, are stealing a pig from their neighbor, a white guy named Absalom Johnson. And Johnson encounters them and begins to berate them. And of course, slaves are supposed to play the game in which they look at the ground and they apologize and they shuffle their feet. And instead, Gabriel tackles Johnson, fights him to the ground, and then bites off the better part of his left ear. That's a capital crime. You're not supposed to bite white people, and Gabriel does. So he sends to be hanged. He's in jail in Richmond. But there was an old glitch in the law. There's a major reform in Virginia law after the Revolution. But one thing that remained was benefit of clergy. The old medieval idea, if you can say a passage from the Bible, and Gabriel could, probably his parents were Afro-Baptists or Afro-Methodists, hence the name Gabriel Solomon. If you can do that, then they don't hang you. So he was given an open court. People are watching. The biblical 39 lashes, and then his thumb is branded with a cross, so that if he does this again, you can only get it once, and now he's got this kind of mark of Cain on his thumb. So there he is, sitting in jail, and we'll know this for sure, but certainly I think it's very, very plausible. He's been beaten, humiliated, branded. He's big, he's literate, he's skilled. Were he a white guy in Philadelphia, he'd own his own blacksmith shop. And here he is, a guy hiring his time and giving a majority of his wages to a guy who probably was his childhood friend, and now is his owner. So I'm pretty sure it's here he begins to plan. It's also clear he'd heard about what was happening in French Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, the Night of Fire, 1791. Refugees from Haiti were washing up, especially in Norfolk. There's some in Richmond. And one slave actually was heard outside of a window saying, "Here's how they did it in the French islands. We can do it here too." Now, obviously, the demographics in Virginia are not that in Saint-Domingue, which is about 95% white. But George Washington's underfunded, undermanned army had toppled an empire. So there's reason to think this could get done. So for about 2 months, it kind of whispers, and Gabriel is kind of quietly talking to people like Solomon, his brother Martin, who I think actually may be his half brother. And finally, on August 10, the times come, they need big numbers. And there's a child's funeral by Young Spring, and there's currently a historical marker by Young Spring. And so all these slaves are there for a child's funeral, and Gabriel gets up and says, "I got this plan." And who's in? And what's interesting, Gabriel says he has a plan, quote, for his country. So not a plan for Black freedom, a plan for his country to make his country a better place. And what an American idea. So what you're looking at here is one of the many trial documents. One of the ways to get a job as a court clerk in the 18th to 19th century is to have very nice handwriting. Whoever this was had very nice handwriting. So he's writing down what people are being deposed and are saying. So here they're talking about this meeting. This is, again, deposition given by a captured slave. He's talking about, by the way through, Gabriel's being appointed general, George Smith is second in command. No one will be spared of the whites, except, this is a big except for Quakers, Methodists, and French people, because France now had abolished slavery in their Caribbean empire. Later on, he says also white women who are poor, have no slaves, we'll kind of leave them alone too. But then, of course, if you're going to be an army, you've got to have a flag. So Gabriel's going to get a piece of silk on which he's going to have written "Death or Liberty," and the court clerk underlines that. So apparently, the person being deposed really, emphasized that. I was asked by students who he's quoting, and they kind of look at me. Obviously, anybody in Richmond would get this. So I've always wondered, and again, quite possibly as a child, he actually laid eyes on Patrick Henry. Did he remember the speech incorrectly? And so instead of "give me liberty" or "give me death," he has "death or liberty," or is he willfully, consciously transposing the words? Because so far this has been a revolution for white people, and not yet for Black people. And so this time it will be "death or liberty." And so this is the most American of conspiracies. And also at this meeting, there's a giant guy who digs ditches named Jack Ditcher. He's even bigger than Gabriel. And Jack Ditcher gets up and says, "Well, I should be in command." And they decide to take a vote. And Gabriel says, "Who's for me?" And the hands go up. "And who's for Jack?" And the hands go up. And Gabriel has more votes. Again, this is the late summer of 1800, election year. As a reminder, Gabriel probably is a fourth, fifth generation Black Virginian. These people are not Africans. They've done the most American of things. They've just had an election, and Gabriel has won. I decided at this meeting that August 30 is going to be the day, and August 30 is a Saturday, and most slaves had half day off on Saturday, and then they have Sunday off. And if you live anywhere near Richmond, you go into town and see old friends, or your free uncle, or you have a drink. If you're an enslaved woman, you bring in things to eggs to sell in town. So seeing people move around the countryside on a Saturday night would not be unusual for whites. It wouldn't kind of excite white paranoia. It's not clear how many followers Gabriel had. White newspapers always exaggerate. He had 5,000 followers. He probably had 50, 60, maybe 70 really committed followers. But I think Gabriel understood that a slave revolt is not an event, it's a process. And when his people meet on Brookfield and they go rolling across a farm with 5 slaves as they're heading toward Richmond, those slaves have like 2 minutes to decide, are they in or are they out? So he doesn't need to have 1,000 guys at Brookfield. He needs to have, a kind of a core group of lieutenants. And as they move toward Richmond, then they pick people up as they go. Then they move into town and they take the governor, James Monroe, hostage. They didn't have a list of those who would die. And of course, Gabriel's master is on that list. Monroe is not going to die. He will be taken hostage. He's going to be kind of, the bartering tool. And again, some whites will not die. And Gabriel clearly says, once we have the town controlled and we have the governor with a gun against his head and we cut a deal, he said, on that day, I will dine and drink a toast with the merchants of the city. So this is not an escape plan. This is a plan to take over, compromise, force Virginia into doing what they should have done with the Tucker plan. And then he's going to live and prosper as a free artisan. So we got the date set, and that day it begins to rain. And again, I live here in Syracuse. We don't have snow days at my college. We just plow out. We keep going. The plows hit my street about 4 o'clock in the morning. We have even little plows that plow the sidewalks on my campus. So I tell my students that this conspiracy is washed out. They're like, it's just rain. Probably most of you recall the big rains in 2004. And I was actually giving a talk in Richmond right after that, and cars had been kind of washed down the street. Anyone recall what day that was? It was August 30. It was the same day, decades and decades later. So what had been little creeks turned into flooded rivers. A lot of slaves can't get to Brookfield. So they're standing there wet, and Gabriel says, well, we'll try it again next night. But 2 neighboring farm slaves realize this is their chance. They don't have information. Probably this is going to be a failure. So their one chance to free themselves and not die in the process is to tell their owner. And so they do. And the owner does get into town and notifies the governor, Monroe, who calls out the militia, and they go rolling around the countryside. And Gabriel vanishes, probably by way of the Chickahominy Creek swamp, which is what swamps are for, that hide in. Of course, it runs right past Brookfield. He gets all the way down to Norfolk. The governor puts out a reward, $300 on Gabriel's head. And ironically, he's turned in by a slave in Norfolk who sees him and goes, I know that guy. That guy's Gabriel, because he figures $300 can buy his freedom. And so informing on Gabriel will be his ticket out of slavery. So actually, Gabriel is turned in by a slave for the reward. So this is the one letter written by a conspirator after the conspiracy has collapsed, now September 20. So Gabriel's still on the run. Again, he's captured on the 23rd. And this letter just tells us so much. And most of my students can no longer read cursive. And for those who can't, dear friend, tell Jacob and John Williams, which is in the state, that John Williams is a state, that Johnny is taken up and will be hanged. I is afraid. To all you now in Gloucester County, must be still yet. Brother X will come and preach a sermon to you soon, and then you will know more about the business. I must be killed. If the white people catch me and carry me to Richmond, I am your true friend, A.W. And once I read this to my students, they really puzzle it out. Who's Brother X? Could be Gabriel, probably not, but AW, whoever he is not foolish enough to put names on a document that's being carried in the mails. And they're also amazed that slaves are using the mails. Actually, there were free black mail carriers in Virginia at the time. And his spelling is pretty bad, but it's no worse than any kind of middle-class white Virginia farmer at the time. And so it tells you a lot. Plus, I love you'll know more about the business. In 1796, an English radical tries to assassinate King George, and he's captured. And they say, how long have you been involved in this plan to kill the king? And he says, I've been involved in the business for about 2 years. I mean, revolution is their business. It's this kind of slang term in the Atlantic world among mariners for getting revolutions done. So a great fanfare. Gabriel's going to be brought back to Richmond. This is from the newspaper. And it says there's going to be a meeting between the governor, an interview with the governor. But they're not happy about the way Gabriel is behaving. Gabriel is said to have manifested the utmost composure and with the true spirit of heroism. And so he's going to meet with the governor. And by the time he gets back to Richmond, he's brought back by a boat from Norfolk. The governor's son is very, very sick. In fact, he dies the next day. And so Gabriel's unloaded, and this giant flock of whites and blacks turn out in the courthouse square to see him. And Gabriel is hustled in chains into the penitentiary. And then the next morning, the governor's young son dies. And so contrary to what the paper predicted, there never was a meeting between Gabriel and Monroe. And I wish there had been. I mean, that would have been a fascinating image of this old white revolutionary. Monroe always still wore the white top boots of the revolutionary generation, meeting with this young black revolutionary who talked about natural rights. It would have been a great, two-person play, but it never happened. So Gabriel, of course, was sentenced to die. He dies on the same day as 10 other slaves, but they're hanged all over the place. 4 are hanged right near Brookfield. And of course, it was common when a slave is hanged for masters to bring their slaves to watch as an object lesson. This is what happens, if you misbehave. Some are hanged on the countryside, so only Gabriel alone is hanged in Richmond. And here's an old map, burial ground for Negroes. And so this is a free black burial ground. There's trees just to the left here that don't appear obviously on the map. So the gallows are kind of hidden, kind of out in the woods below, behind some bushes and trees. And of course, then you just hang Gabriel and then you plant him in the ground right there. You don't give the body back to the family. So he dies alone, the gallows. 27 men altogether die. So of course, probably a lot of you have seen this. This is where it is today. And there's a historical marker that's up on top of the bridge and a marker down below. This was for a very long time a parking lot. At one point was owned by VCU, and now it's just this kind of empty lot next to the freeway. And probably a lot of you know there's a debate about what to do. There's a group in Richmond that would like to acquire the land, memorialize it. Probably a lot of you know in 15 years or so ago, people were digging in New York City and dug up an old free black and slave burial ground and did really fascinating, things with the bones. What they were finding, children's bones were bowed because they were carrying heavy, loads, and then reinterred with proper honors. And so some people who would like to acquire the land and memorialize it just want to get the blacktop up, put down some grass. If you look at that map, you superimpose a modern Google map over it. The best guess is the freeway has not actually disturbed the graveyard. And so the historian in me would like to do the same kind of experiments they did in New York and then rebury the bodies or the bones, whatever's left, with proper reverence. And again, a lot of them simply, were old and died, but Gabriel would be the guy down there with a broken neck. And so it's quite possible, actually, if they could get in there, they might know which body is his. Obviously, as you all know, especially in Richmond, we are now in the midst of this kind of national debate about what to do about older monuments, Confederate monuments, statues to people like Jefferson Davis. And there has been this kind of ongoing discussion of how to memorialize Gabriel, apart from just kind of putting some grass on top of that parking lot. And I checked online a couple of days ago, and I see there is this online petition to have a statue erected to Gabriel. It doesn't have a lot of signatures yet. And so, of course, statues to Robert Lee are coming down. Then should statues of Gabriel, be put up? Probably, I'm sure a lot of you know, in 2007, Tim Kaine pardoned Gabriel and his followers. It was an informal pardon because, of course, it was a posthumous pardon. But the question of violence is a tough one. And the book I wrote after this was a book about Denmark Vesey, the Black abolitionist rebel in South Carolina. And they finally got a partial statue up to him a few years ago with great difficulty and an anti-Vesey statue newspaper campaign. And I was actually giving a talk in Charleston when this was going on, and one person in back, a white guy about my age, got up and said, well, do we want to celebrate violence? And why didn't Vesey lead a peaceful protest march? And I said, well, because 1822 Charleston is not the world of Martin King. And those guys were beaten too. I said, if you show me, a man leading a peaceful protest march in Charleston or Richmond in 1800, I'll show you a black man hanging from a tree branch. But the violence is it's hard to deal with. I mean, I will say again, Gabriel's plan is not Nat Turner's plan. I mean, Nat Turner's plan is simply anybody who's white is going to die. Gabriel has his list of those who are ready to live, who are ready to die. He plans, again, to live and survive. And I was talking to one person, one of these public lectures, and he said, well, the difference is, if you're in the Army, and my dad was in World War II, you're fighting guys your age, and they're men, and they're wearing a uniform, and they're fighting for their country. And I thought, yeah, but think back to 2004, when the Gulf War II began, and we're all watching our television, and there is shock and awe, and bombs raining down on Baghdad, and that was not just Republican Guard who were dying. To a certain extent, slavery was a war, and Gabriel was a warrior. And, again, you look at these documents where he talks about, I have a plan for my country. We're going to have an election, and I will be elected general. These are very American things. And so, I'm a father, soon to be a grandfather in August. And so, the death of non-combatants in any war, Civil War, World War II, Hiroshima is always troubling. But Gabriel, again, had been beaten. He'd been branded. His world did not make him soft, did not make him inclined to turn the other cheek. And so I think to insist that all enslaved people need to act like Martin King or Mohandas Gandhi, while white people can rain bombs down on Baghdad, I think is a kind of a strange double standard I don't have a lot of patience for. And I say that as an old white guy. So I've talked over my time. I'm thrilled to take questions, discussion, debate. And again, thank you so much for coming to hear me. I wish we could have done this in person someday. Yes, maybe.
Professor Egerton, thank you so much for this. I've been a fan since reading Moore's Reconstruction. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the effects of Gabriel's revolution on the impact of Virginia's approach to militia, slave control and that sort of thing. And we've heard so much about the effect of Nat Turner's 1831, but how did that have that effect? And this kind of the second part of that is, how was this part of that concept of rebellion that you talked about with Shays Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion? These were all part of his psyche at that time. Surely. Yeah.
Great question, and it's actually not to kind of pass it up, but actually there are chapters on that in the book. So Virginia passes a series of laws right after the conspiracy collapses. It's like they go down the list. What allowed for this to happen? Slaves to hire their time, slaves to live away for their master, slaves to be boatmen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So over the next few years, they pass a series of laws basically banning all those things, banning Black literacy, which doesn't last very long. The question, of course, is always how long do these kind of tough controls last before they kind of quietly begin to lapse? And of course, the reason why Gabriel is often in Richmond is because he does hire his time. Again, he's a blacksmith, so is his brother. He runs out of things to do, and there's nothing else to fix on the plantation, so he's allowed to wander into town or help a nearby farmer fix something with his skill. And so to a certain extent, that kind of reallocation of unfree labor is necessary for Southern, especially urban society, to take place. And so these laws that are passed, pretty quickly are allowed to lapse. And same thing with slave patrols. A friend of mine named Sally Haddon has a great book called Slave Patrols. And Sally demonstrated that every time there's a conspiracy like this, that Turner, Denmark, Vesey, for the next 2 years, everybody's out riding patrols, and then they're like, well, it's kind of quiet and it's dark at night and it's cold. Do I really have to ride patrols? Yeah, there's ministers riding patrols. So that kind of vanishes fairly quickly. So yeah, there are a lot of these laws that are passed. And my guess is they're kind of quietly allowed to lapse, in part because they essentially kind of get in the way of running a smooth economy in the Richmond area.
What unofficial reaction we know from the white people? I presume the press, the news was whatever it was, but do we have any correspondence from the people who were part of this, whose slaves participated? Do we have, because I guess I'm thinking about trying to translate 200 years ago to today.
Yeah.
And I live in a central city, and the night they killed George Floyd, I'm standing looking out my third floor window, and I can see the business district 6 blocks away burning.
Yeah.
And I was scared. So I'm wondering if we have heard from the white people in that area. How scared were they, and how much did they know?
Well, that's a really great question, and it was well covered in the press, and of course this was also the period of kind of cut and paste newspapers. So the New York Journal will have from the Richmond Enquirer, that kind of thing. So it's been covered all across the country, and actually talking about looking out the window and seeing the burning. One guy who's riding from DC to Richmond writes his mother and said all along the entire way along the road, the militia is out. And they've got bayonets fixed, and I think the term he uses is they're bristling, his bayonets. So yeah, the state is really under this kind of high alert for a moment. And clearly there's some anecdotal evidence from women that this is terrifying, and of course there's always the rumor that what black guys really want is not Black freedom and their earnings, but they want, the white ladies. So those allegations pop up as well. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, one of the best sources we have for what's happening in the jail is a journalist named James T Calippo. A lot of you know about James T Calendar, who was a Republican turned Federalist, put on trial under the Sedition Act. So he's actually in jail, and he's writing to Jefferson. And he says, oh, in the next cell, these guys are singing songs, they're singing hymns. And he said, I just saw Gabriel walk by and change. And so he's actually writing almost kind of a daily basis. He has nothing else to do. He's in jail. Writing to Jefferson and talking about what he's seeing in jail. And interestingly enough, you also have people, and Jefferson is one of these. They're wedded to slavery, but they also, Jefferson always says slavery is a necessary evil. He never tries to defend it as a positive good. And so the hanging stop. Again, they hang 27 guys. The hanging stop for 2 reasons. And one is Virginia has a law, unlike South Carolina, you have to compensate a master. If you hang his slaves, you've taken his property and hanged it. So they're all valued. So I actually have an accountant come in, look at Gabriel and say, he's literate, he's big, he's a blacksmith, $500, which is a lot of money. So at one point, the treasurer writes to Monroe and says, we're running out of money. You got to stop hanging people, which is also why they get to transport people. But Jefferson doesn't have the stomach. So Jefferson, is a slaveholder, major slaveholder, doesn't really have the stomach to do this. So he writes to Monroe and he says, the feeling, I love this phrase, the feeling here, meaning on his hilltop in Monticello, the feeling here is that there have been hangings enough. Time to stop. So there is a lot of squeamishness and there's a lot of fear among whites in Virginia. And of course, it's John Randolph of Roanoke later on famously says, the church bell never tolls at midnight that the mother does not clutch the child closer to her chest, because is that Gabriel and his men with their scythe swords coming through the door? So yeah, it's a really good question. Reg Ackerman, Reg is a great historian, has a new book out. He's writing a series of biographies of Stephen Douglas, who's not a normally very loved guy. And so buy Reg's new book on Stephen Douglas. And Reg writes, to what extent did Toussaint Louverture influence or inspire Gabriel to revolution? And again, what we know that Gabriel says is what people ask him in court. So nobody actually says to him, what do you think about Haiti? But again, there's a very large number of white refugees and bringing slaves with them who are coming into Virginia. So the only way Gabriel could not know what was happening in Haiti would be, to like be a field hand in the middle of no place. And again, he's not. He's a guy who is skilled, literate, often in Richmond. And again, if you look at the demographics that allowed for the Haitian Revolution to happen, it's just, something like 450,000 young slaves in Haiti, 25,000 mixed race, free people, 25,000 whites. That's not Virginia's demographic. But stories like that are inspirational. And so I think what they remind Gabriel is, there's a real risk here. Probably, certainly anyone who goes into a slave conspiracy has to know the chances are they're not going to make it. I mean, Gabriel, I think is not silly. But there's an example that it happened. I mentioned also, my talk that Washington's underfunded army, far smaller than any British army, topples an empire. And so I think, Gabriel figures this is the time that is right to do this. So yeah, that's kind of the best answer I have for Reg. Okay, that's all right. So I think Gabriel would have made it to Richmond and actually captured Monroe had he not been turned in. And here's the danger of publishing a book. It's too late when you rethink things. I'm a friend of mine, Phil Suarez, who taught for years at Virginia Commonwealth, and organized, this is 20 years ago at NEH down in Virginia. And the way I wrote the book, either he's going to get into Richmond and he'll succeed. He'll take hostages, like Monroe hostage. People will die, and Virginia will opt for gradual emancipation or immediate emancipation, or what happened, it rained and he dies. It then dawned on me, probably the most likely scenario was the one I didn't think of when I was writing the book, which is it doesn't rain. Gabriel does make it into Richmond. It is a bloody mess. He dies, Monroe dies. And that does prod Virginia into passing a law for emancipation, probably combined with forced colonization. So freedom would come to Virginia, not on Gabriel's terms, and probably not with Gabriel alive to see it. So my best guess is it become this sort of Spartacus-like debacle, with kind of huge death toll on both sides. So when the 25th anniversary of the book came around, I wrote to UNC and I said, how about a new addition to maybe a new intro? I've got some new ideas. They're like, yeah, never mind. So, because I think actually that's probably the most likely scenario.
Doctor, you started your speech tonight talking about the meaning of the American Revolution.
Yes.
And the idea that all men are created equal. And you said it's not about the battle, it's about the ideas
right
in the Constitution. When do you think we're going to treat all these slave rebellions as true heroes of our American history?
Well,
that they fought for the true meaning of the Constitution.
That's a good question, and I'll say this: I don't think the job of historians is to identify heroes and villains, and some people kind of sort themselves out and are clearly heroic, and others are clearly villainous. People are complicated, and that includes Washington, that includes Jefferson, that includes Gabriel, that includes Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. So for me, I'm less concerned in moralizing somebody as heroic. The reason we put up a statue is because someone has done something exemplary. And here in downtown Syracuse, we have a big Civil War statue to the young man of Onondaga County who went south and fought for the U.S. But I think maybe a better question, or the way I would see it anyway, is we moralize what Gabriel fought for. Maybe 10 years ago or so, Henry Louis Gates did another PBS miniseries, and they did a Gabriel piece, and I was one of the talking heads. And he basically asked me a question: hero or villain? I said, well, what he fought for were American ideals, freedom, liberty, all the ideals, and Jefferson's Declaration. So maybe instead of a memorial to Gabriel or Vesey, although I was all for that, but for the cause they pursued, that because that is a very American cause. So that's probably not a very good answer. And I will say that when it comes to the question of monuments and some war monuments, I've been kind of evolving and rethinking and probably not with great clarity on some of those questions. So I think, Gabriel fought for freedom. Jefferson Davis fought against freedom. And so I think there's a difference there. Ann Walker asked a question about gradual emancipation in Virginia. Children of slave women under 21 would still be enslaved. That's an interesting question. And there are some glitches in Tucker's plan. And so again, one is the woman becomes free at the age of 21. So she's born, say, 1801, after the laws passed, which didn't happen. She becomes 21, so she's free. Tucker didn't seem to consider what would happen if she had a child when she was 16. And of course, slave women marry young in those days. Well, white women marry young in those days. They're not going to go to med school, so they get married. And that's actually not covered by his plan. So would they have to wait till they're 21 and then be free? Because then if she had a child after she was free, the child would be born free regardless of gender. That is kind of the one thing, and my students noticed that too. Sort of the one thing that Tucker missed. But again, it's a 96-page, 101-page plan. And so it could have been tinkered with, but yeah, that's the glitch, and that he didn't seem to catch. But of course, he's a guy, so thinking about giving birth probably was something he didn't think too much about. And James asked, to what extent did the rebellion affect abolition national, such as it was at the time? Well, the bad news is there actually were a handful of white abolition societies in Virginia in the late 70s. And people like St. George Tucker, who were connected, usually urbanites. And that just stopped after 1800. And we don't know it's because of Gabriel, but my guess is certainly it became very, very unpopular to hold a white anti-slavery, pro-abolition meeting in any big Virginia urban area after Gabriel. So the bad news is it has a really negative effect in Virginia. That's also the price of failure. He dies again. I suspect that after he bit the white man over the hog stealing incident, he came home. I guess it's probably Nanny took a frying pan to his head. What she needs is a live husband and not a dead martyr, and they're going to hang him, for that. And so, I mean, there is always a high price for failure, and Gabriel and his brother Solomon and his half brother Martin paid that price.
I was really interested in your book about the workers that hired out, the enslaved, that came into the city and hired out, and who mingled, in the bars or in the streets on a Saturday, with white working people, and that sort of thinking that it would be almost more of a labor rebellion against the elites. And but that didn't, we didn't really talk about that tonight, but did he really think that would happen? Was that really part of the business that they were talking about?
Yeah, I think so. And again, every historian wants to go back in time and say, okay, here's the questions I want to ask Gabriel as he's sitting in jail, as opposed to questions they're asking. They're asking who else is involved, who'd you contact, that kind of thing. But again, that one quotation where Gabriel says he will drink a toast with the merchants of the city, not the planters, but the merchants of the city, because of course they are the political elite in the Richmond urban area, the guys who own the ships and the docks. And there's actually something very kind of bourgeois about the conspiracy. There's a warehouse district down on the edge of town near where Tredegar, or now the Civil War Museum is. And one of the ideas is they'll burn Rocket's warehouse, and whites will flock toward it, and then they'll kill some whites. And one person says, "Oh no, we need those after we're done, after we're free. I will build those, and I want part of that warehouse space." So there's something kind of very wonderfully middle class about these guys. They talk a lot about property and money because, you know, again, some of them are making it. In terms of these kind of waterfront taverns where Gabriel, free blacks, sailors, a couple of French guys. There clearly are a couple of white French guys, veterans involved in the conspiracy, or at least on the edges of the conspiracy. You know, are they actively talking class revolution? Probably not. But as they sit down and have a tankard of ale, and there is a white Irish tavern woman, a handful of Gabriel's guys they're identified as having white wives. Of course, they're not actually legal wives, but these are working class women who've taken up with free or enslaved guys. There's something very dangerously egalitarian about that kind of collection. Which is why police are always raiding these kind of waterfront taverns. Because even if someone doesn't get up on a tankard or the tankard and say, "Let's kill white people," like happens in New York City in 1741, their discourse, you know, race is breaking down and class matters a lot more, and that's dangerous in a slave society. So I think, and of course that's also one of Gabriel's flaws, because he spends so much time in Richmond. He tends to think that the merchants are the real problem. They're not the real problem. It's the planter class that's the real problem. But again, he doesn't live in the middle of nowhere, Virginia. He lives in this kind of urbanized corridor right outside of you know, the capital city. So he's kind of missing that part of the picture.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful, stimulating program. What's amazing for us here in Richmond is we have a local audience, but we also have people from across the country, from Maine and Minnesota.
And Maine there. That's fantastic.
It's fantastic. And we miss seeing you in person. I hope you'll be back again to this fair city and we'll get that opportunity. But how wonderful that we could bring you to so many people across the country tonight.
Well, thank you so much for asking. And I really appreciate you all tuning in. And thanks so much.
Well, thank you. And best of luck with the end of the semester.
It can't end soon enough.
I know. Goodbye. Good night, everyone. And thanks for joining us. Good night.